next talk from Josie Bernard is going to be, half of it is a talk and half of it is an exercise. So the exercise part will be only possible to do with the physical participants. So we are unable to bring the online participants into the room so far. Maybe next year we can do holographic participation. Not this year yet. So and also welcome everybody to the beginning of the seminar. We have 2 busy days coming up. A lot of talk about film, a lot of talk about filmmaking, and hopefully a lot of good ideas. The focus of this seminar is also to bring people together who have common interests. And it looks like we have quite a lot of interesting topics already appearing. In the morning session, we talked about script writing, and Josie will definitely continue this talk about a multimodal writer. But Josie knows everything about creativity, so I'm super excited to hear what she has to say. Welcome, Josie.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and welcome everybody. Yeah, this oh, quite loud. This talk is the multimodal writer on storytelling and writing visuals, and I'm going to launch right in because my slides have got the introduction as well. So if we could see the slides. Thank you. So there's the title. Are we moving along? For some reason it's not moving along. We have help. Okay, so while we wait for the help and we wait for the next slide, I'm going to start introducing myself. So I think one of the important things to say here, thank you very much, we're on the next slide, is that you can continue. Okay. Is that my background is practice. So I was a creative practitioner for many years, and so I've written novels. I've written 2 novels, 3 creative non-fiction books. I've done print journalism. I've done a lot of radio journalism. I've written 1 film for short script. So there's a huge amount of different creative practice feeding into what then became an academic program of research. So I've never stopped being a practitioner, but I also began doing academic research in 2012. Now, around 2012, I think people may kind of, perhaps not so much in Estonia, but certainly in the UK, it started really hitting home that digital was going to really transform what it was to be a creative practitioner. And that was in every aspect, that it was going to affect how creative work was made, how creative work was disseminated, and then, of course, many creative practitioners, before they get fame and fortune, if that's what they want, before that point arrives, of course, you've got to have what's known as a day job, and it's also going to affect the day job. So to think about digital was just going to be really, really central for all creative practitioners, regardless of what route they wanted to take at the end, as I say, whether that focus is on creative practice or mixing creative practice and a day job. So my slides are going up and down, so excuse me if my attention sometimes goes on the screen in the front. One of the key things, it seemed to me, back then in 2012, which now seems so long ago, was that, thank you, was that digital upskilling is a movable feast. It's a moving target. So that one piece of discrete digital upskilling is very, very limited in how it can help for how long. So famously, ASCII code became obsolete. Suddenly all these people who were trained up in ASCII had something that looked obsolete. And anybody who is familiar with Twitter may remember that pre-Elon Musk, that there was a point at which the word count, the character count, importantly, suddenly increased. There was another point at which the way in which you demonstrated that you were interested in a tweet changed, so the like button changed from a star to a heart. And I remember really vividly a lot of people tweeting that they would never use the heart. The heart was too ridiculous, and of course that faded. So, and the recent changes of Twitter have just highlighted that these platforms are owned by other people. They aren't constant, they change. So in the midst of all this change, it seemed to me that creativity was central. So I set about doing a program of research that drew on my practice as a writer, as a journalist, as a radio producer and a radio presenter. And I submitted evidence to the House of Lords and in the UK. And my research was pulled together as something called a Research Excellence Framework 2021 Impact Case Study. So it was submitted because it was also having impact outside academia. So that's a summary of me and where I've come from. I'm going to talk, and so this was some of the evidence that I submitted to the Culture Select Committee in the UK. And the focus here was really on something very simple, which was that it was picked up and quoted by somebody called, an MP called Sharon Hodgson. And what she picked up was actually a very, very simple thing. So my background as an academic is creative writing. And what the MP picked up out of my evidence was very simply, students who are taught creative writing are taught creative thinking. So creativity is key in my view, and that in order to remain digitally upskilled, and I'm going to put that in quotes because I think being digitally upskilled is very limited. In order to remain digitally upskilled in a way that means that you have productive and sustainable digital engagement that actually works really well for you, creative flexibility is necessary. So before going to the specifics of how I decided I was going to address that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader context, which in the UK is called digital inclusion. So I've got two sets of figures here. One is 2017 and one is 2021. Now, the reason I included 2021 rather than, say, 2022 or 2023 is because there was an assumption that after the COVID pandemic, we would see a natural uplift, increase of digital skills. Because certainly in the UK, there was quite a heavy lockdown for a period, and everything suddenly went online after it had not been online. And so people didn't have any choice. Digital was no longer optional. Despite that, in 2021, 29% of the UK adults still had very low digital skills. There was still a significant number of people in the UK who were what's called completely digitally excluded. They couldn't get online. And 56% of educators surveyed in 2021 said that teachers and learners do not have the skills needed to make digital learning a success. So what we're seeing is that between 2017 in the UK and 2021, despite a lockdown that made digital skills essential, and they were not optional, and if you didn't have them, various things in your life were simply not available to you, and yet it had kind of pretty much stagnated. There was some improvement, but really not very much. What skills do people need to be digital? One of the problems is this shift that I have spoken about already. So two quotes that I think articulate this kind of new way of being very well are one from Elwell, who says, self-identity occupies the liminal space between the virtual and the real, revealing a trans-mediated self constituted as a browsable story world that is integrated, dispersed, episodic, and interactive. And Brian Rotman, speaks about it like this: the I-me unit is dissolving, and he's thinking about social media now. So the way in which we might have one presence on Instagram, one presence on LinkedIn, one presence on Spotify, because Spotify is still social media. You still have a kind of image on there in the form of the name, maybe whether or not you have followers and so forth. So the I-me unit is dissolving. The one who says or writes I is no longer a singular integrated whole, but multiple, a plurality of distributed I effects, I roles, I functions, and I presences. And this is, I think, as well as articulating very well, can become rather unnerving, because the idea of oneself as distributed and dispersed it becomes very slippery and hard to get hold of. Gunter Kress says, using tools that had served well to fix horse-drawn carriages becomes a problem in mending contemporary cars. So essentially, we need new tools. And that was where I was coming from, is what new tool can be developed to help in what is our new digital landscape that really is it's much more than only digital. It's really everywhere now. And so I set about empirically testing how to develop the kind of creative flexibility that would enable the kind of movement that has become simply necessary. And to do that, I decided to test it with discrete assignments. So what I did was I identified, well, what are the constant skills? What are the skills that are going to remain even if the different softwares, platforms change? So for example, the need to engage with bricolage, a need to engage with nonlinear narratives. These are some of the constants. And so I devised a set of assignments that are designed specifically to develop those discrete skills. And I also designed something called the multimodal practice model of creativity that is designed to be personalized, and I can't emphasize that enough, is I cannot give a single model of creativity to everybody here that will work for everybody in the same way. But I can help each person here develop one that is useful for them and for their needs, and one that factors in their prior and existing experience and expertise, and can then be adapted as each one as everybody here moves forwards into different futures and anticipates new problems that maybe hadn't been anticipated, indeed couldn't have been anticipated. So the book came out in 2019, and it has since been, so I tested it with students. I worked with students, and the feedback was not only obviously wonderful because it helped develop and refine the model, but it was fascinating and inspiring to see how different people function creatively. So that was really, really exciting. And then since then, I have also been testing it beyond creative writing, because one of the things that I suppose seems really important to me is that the idea of creativity, it can help other people. So let's see if it can. So during the pandemic, I worked with some staff of charities that work with digitally excluded citizens, and it was found to be very helpful and very effective, which was great in very, very different ways. On the far side of the slide there, somebody called Holdstock used the model to help school children in an English classroom in the UK produce a Frankentext, what Holdstock calls a Frankentext, so a work of interactive fiction. An element of the model, which is remediation of practice, was used by somebody called Wrangle, who is a practitioner and a teacher. and she essentially remediated practice from both her creative outputs and her academic outputs, and used them to develop a series of podcasts. So the need for digital skills, 82% of online, this was back in 2020, 82% of online advertised job openings in the UK require a good level of digital competencies from applicants. That's Nesta. Is obviously going up. That was back in 2020. Jobs likely to grow by 2030. Jobs asking for creativity. So the important thing here is not the digital skills, even the job market is recognizing that. So what Nesta has done is it had a look at how employers' needs are articulated in job descriptions. Digital skills are now really a given. Creativity is what's seen as really important. So what Nesta spoke about in 2019 was something that they refer to as the sweet spot, and that this will be where digital skills meet creativity. So we know is important. So now I'm going to start thinking about one of the things that I want to think about is the conference. The conference description talks of the embodied cognitive processes of storytellers. And the conference has a mission, a starting point assumption, that filmmakers and viewers alike build their experience and sense-making on the same embodied foundation as their occasional references to instincts or gut feelings may suggest. That's a quote from Ticker. And so one of the things that I want to think about today is that embodied experience. So creativity is really exciting. Obviously, one of the things about the model is that I'm saying actually we can develop it and we can target it and we can harness it. But it is also absolutely the case that we still have very limited knowledge of how the brain works, of how creativity works. So there's a great quote from Catherine Hales, which is that scientific truths of one generation have the unsettling tendency to be overturned or reversed in the next, especially in fields as rapidly developing as brain science and the science of consciousness. And then somebody called Andy Clark speaks about our mashup minds. So on the one hand, we've got these huge unknowns, the unknowns of what's going on inside our brains. We've got the unknowns of what's going to happen with this. Even if you think Instagram might be stable, who knows what's going to happen if there's a buyout. And yet, as Andy Clark frames it, with our mashup minds working at the productive interface of brain, body, and social and material world, messy but powerful solutions are reliably found. So we managed to pull everything together, really, I suppose. It's quite extraordinary as human beings. And often, confidence and trust in that process is really important. So we're taking as multimodal, so I'm going to just look at the word multimodal briefly because I've used that so often. So multimodal texts are characterized by the mixed logics brought together through the combination of modes, such as images, text, and color. And so multimodal is quite a kind of WYSIWYG. We would talk about it as a WYSIWYG word in the UK, in the sense that it is what it says. So you've got multiple modes, multimodal. And that is just the way our interactions with online are. And of course, it's a really, really key characteristic of things like film. And then we've also got social media. Social media is overtaking traditional channels for news among teens. So I don't think anybody here is going to be unaware of the way TikTok has suddenly stepped right into the forefront. And so TikTok and YouTube are now their top 3 most used sources for news. Meanwhile, many sources have seen decreases since 2021, with the reach of BBC One 2 decreasing to 24%. That's down not by 24%, but to 24%, down from 35% in 2021. So visuals are now becoming increasingly important. And I think that probably had a leap during COVID. They were already being predicted to be important around kind of 2018. But really during COVID, that became fixed, I guess. And so how does one pull all this together? And so, as I say, the model is one element. It's too big a thing to go through in a single lecture, but I can focus on one element of it, which is remediation of practice. So Gunter Kress spoke about the need for new tools and the theory of remediation of practice, whereby as new challenges and opportunities arise, a writer looks to existing skills and prior experience and adapts or applies them in new contexts as part of a process of, in effect, collaborating with him or herself in order to enable a systematic and ongoing transfer of skills. So I've referred already to the research, the programme of research, and on the other side of the slide there you can see a summary. So it included a number of separate, smaller studies that are represented by various publications. There was also an auto-practitioner study. I looked at my own practice, my own experience of writing novels and radio programmes and articles and so forth. I also did pedagogical pilots, and I did author interviews with a range of authors who had experience of this kind of creative flexibility of moving between genres and platforms. So they included, for example, Rhianna Pratchett, who was, on the one hand, the lead writer on Tomb Raider, the game, on the other hand, also wrote reviews and film scripts. Similarly, Simon Armitage, who's best known as a poet, but he also writes libretti and novels, for example. So the aim there was to find out what commonalities could be identified in terms of creativity, creative process, creative practice, and also the kinds of things that when people are moving from one genre, for example, to a genre that is new to them or that is completely new, what are the skills that can be drawn on from internally that can then be applied to this new problem? And so one of the new pieces of research, so this was 21 to 22, involved working with partners including Leicester Museum and a charity in the UK called Reaching People. So this is very much a Leicester-based, Leicester is in the Midlands in the UK, and it was a very local, very Leicester-based project. And what the aim, I worked with Professor Goutrier in Berlin. We wanted to provide specific digital skills using old objects, so very much centering on the remediation of practice. And so we did two pilots, Christine and I. One used typewriters and one used vintage telephones. And it was really exciting to see the results. So yesterday, for example, I was at the Film Museum, and it was really wonderful to see a typewriter in there and an old mobile phone, because although we've kept a picture of of very, very old phones there, we actually also used a vintage telephone that was one of the early Nokias. So it was. I don't know if you remember that, but they used to have a little thing in the corner that would allow you to attach a trinket that would personalize it. So. One of the basic reasons for using old technology is it's a helpful reminder that all technology was new once. Even a pencil was once new technology. And this kind of revisiting of personal experience of things that are new to each of us can help provide, as well as a sort of helpful grounding reminder, it can help empower, because, of course, if you faced a technology that was new to you, maybe when you were a kid it was experimenting with a sewing machine, one of those toy sewing machines, if perhaps it was experimenting with shifting up from making sort of more arbitrary Lego constructions to actually following instructions and doing a Lego kit. For everybody here, I'm sure they've got completely different examples. Maybe there's a bit of overlap, but there's certainly going to be a different combination for each person. And that takes people back to a time when it felt okay to experiment. It felt okay to have the possibility of not succeeding. And that if you know, you don't, maybe the sewing machine kind of goes wrong first time and you kind of sew over the armhole instead of round the armhole. But you can have another go. It's not a big deal. So it introduces a confidence about experimenting, and it can introduce fun as well. So the two pilot studies that we did with, so Reaching People is an umbrella charity. And one of the charities that it includes is Leicester Aging Together. So we were working with a group from Leicester Aging Together. And one of the things that was really interesting was the planned outcome was that with the typewriters, we would help them learn about algorithms. And with the telephones, we would help them learn about binary code. So clearly, we didn't expect them to come out at the end of it with full knowledge of how to become a coder. But the aim was to provide enough knowledge to increase confidence. And what was absolutely fascinating, the outcome was great. You know, couldn't have been more pleased with the outcome. The people who were involved with the pilot, many of them before lockdown hadn't even had emails. And by the end of the pilot in which we were working on binary code, by the end of a 60-minute session, some of them were posting correct binary code in the Zoom chat. So we couldn't have been more pleased with that outcome. But on the run-up to that outcome, what was really interesting was how seeing these old telephones or these old typewriters sparked memories and discussions of other bits of vintage technology. So that each person was bringing their own kind of objects, not literally, not physically, because I was in the museum, and Christine Goutrier, Professor Goutrier, was in Berlin, and the participants were remote. So it wasn't literal. They didn't even have them in their rooms where they were doing the Zooms. But in their mind, they were bringing this experience of the past technology into the session and discussing it. And a vibrancy was almost palpable, actually, in the Zoom room. So now we're going to think about all of this in the context of writing visuals and the embodied cognitive processes of storytellers. And I'm going to give some sort of thoughts, really, from my own research into how to write visuals. So, Trollope v. Dickens and Faulkner. Essentially, Anthony Trollope, a writer who's beloved of many, but I have to say I found his descriptions quite limited, shall we say. So he's a very well-known 19th century novelist. He was really highly prolific. Dickens was also highly prolific. But he writes visuals in a very, very different way, in a way that feels much more embodied. So one of the things about Trollope's descriptions is that they often feel very photographic. And that's, a lot of people say that's exactly why they like him. Because if they're interested in finding out about that kind of part of history, they will get a very, very photographic description of, for example, a house, and they will find out all the architectural details of this house, and it will be pieced together, in my view, in a slightly flat way, but it is all there, all the bits. Whereas Dickens takes a different approach, and it feels much more embodied, and a description of a street, for example, or you may feel yourself moving through the urban landscape that he's creating, and he will turn it into a micro story, if you like. So one of the things that Dickens is known for is obviously his long novels. They're big. But a segment of description has a narrative arc. You can feel tension and suspense as you move through these streets. So that for me is wonderful description. Trollope, great, happy to have it. It feels like it might help historical research, but Dickens, inspiring, moving, it really gets you there. Faulkner, it's very, very similar. One of the things about Faulkner, William Faulkner descriptions, and I suppose I need to interject here that one of the things that writers are kind of warned of is not spending too much time on descriptions. So if you have rules in creative writing, one of them is don't spend too long on a description because you'll lose the interest of the reader. Dickens definitely wasn't going along with that rule. Faulkner, similarly, not going along with that rule. Lots of writers don't go along with the rule, but I guess the danger, in a way, for me, is represented by the kind of thing Trollope does. It becomes something that's stuck in the middle of the story, and you have to stop your engagement with the story in order to assess the visuals that are written. Whereas with Dickens, it's very much part of the emotion. With Faulkner, there's an absolutely wonderful scene in the novel that he wrote called As I Lay Dying, where all that happens in terms of the action is that the person who's narrating the story at that particular point is interested in getting some water from a well. That's all that happens. But the emotion that goes through this passage, it turns the bucket that is going to give this particular taste to the water, because it's going to taste of cedar, and it's going to be cool in a really hot night. It's going to be this cool, refreshing water that's slightly tastes of cedar, and it gives a wonderful narrative arc to this, because of course it's almost as if the bucket that is going to give the water is the magical element in a fairy story that is going to deliver this empowering thing to the person who is the protagonist of that particular bit. So writing embodied visuals is a challenge, you know. There are really obvious ways. Perhaps we're talking a sort of Trollope-esque way of doing a visual in a film. So how do we show that we're in London? We have a shot of Big Ben. How do we show that we're in Paris? We have a shot of the Eiffel Tower. Now, I'm not necessarily against that, because, of course, one of the things about a shot of the Eiffel Tower or the shot of Big Ben is that it's quick. So if you want to do a more subtle indication of where you are, then that could be a distraction. If you're trying to keep the viewer moving along quickly, then it could actually serve as a distraction. So something like the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben, they definitely have their place. When I was researching my novel Poker Face, and The Pleasure Dome, I did field research, and what I think many people think of when they think of field research is they think of something that's quite elaborate and involves maybe a big trip, and you definitely have to have a kind of big need for it. Maybe you have to personally experience going up a mountain in order to be able to write it. These were the two bits that I'm thinking of in particular here were very low key. One of them, I needed to describe the character, this was for Poker Face, being in a field in Yorkshire. So that's all, quote unquote. So I'm familiar with fields in Yorkshire. I'm familiar with grass. I'm familiar with fences. Why couldn't I simply go to any old field, or just remember? Why couldn't I just remember? And I think that and I tried that, of course, because I didn't particularly want to, go on a trip to a field. This didn't particularly seem exciting research to me either. But it became clear that I was writing a very, very flat scene. And this was a pivotal scene emotionally for the main character. And it needed the kind of narrative arc that Faulkner achieves. And so in order to do this, all I did was I went up, stood in a field and wrote reams and reams and reams and reams of notes. And the reason for that was to capture lots and lots of different options of ways to describe the character's emotions, because that's all that was happening in that scene. It was the character had a transition of emotions. And the feel of the wind on the face, that's the kind of thing you cannot capture in a picture. The feel of the turf under the feet, again, can't be captured in a picture. And similarly for the pleasure dome, there was another point of emotional transition that was happening in a street. And by then I was very happy. I like this kind of research, and so it certainly wasn't something I was reluctant to do. But it was really looking for the things that will map onto and stimulate the kind of the emotions that are needed for that particular scene. And so again, it's things like for the scene I'm thinking of in the Pleasure Dome, it was scaffolding. And the scaffolding and the way the light was hitting the scaffolding. Now, I could have got that from a picture, perhaps, but the point was to also experience it and to experience looking up at this scaffolding. So I could imagine being the character at so they are at an emotional point when they arrive at that street, and then they experience that scaffolding, and because of the emotional journey they're on and the events, there's a point where they stop and they concentrate on their surroundings. And again, lots and lots and lots of notes, very little taken from it in terms of the final text. But even the experience of writing the notes is part of getting into the mindset of the character. And then that leads to one of the other things that I'm going to reflect on, which is point of view. So in terms of writing visuals, I think one of the things that is becoming clear that I kind of feel is really, really important is to understand that there isn't a thing that is perceived in the same way by everybody. Each person brings a state of mind in the same way that they bring experience. And so the point of view is also important. So in terms of writing visuals, if the novel or the film is taking an omniscient viewpoint, then there might be a kind of a pan across a street where you take it all in, kind of long shot style. But if it's first person, it may be very, very close up. It may be that the granular texture of the brick becomes important rather than the distant architectural construction. So the omniscient as opposed to the first person writing of visuals may be very different. Similarly, if it's a very young child, something as simple as a table may seem unnerving because, of course, what to an adult is something that's perfectly manageable, and to a child has a corner that could become dangerous. It could alternatively become very exciting. The table could be a place to hide beneath, particularly if it has a tablecloth. And then, of course, the perspective changes completely because the table is polished on the top, perhaps, but very rough underneath. And so the texture of the underneath of the table may become a valuable part of creating the visuals. Similarly, if you have the same landscape being negotiated by somebody who's just committed a criminal act and is on the run versus a person with a hurt leg. So if you're on the same street, a person who is on the run might be jumping over the bollards, ducking down an alley. Person who has hurt their leg is going to be quite cautious along the side, and maybe the railings become important because they're things to hold on to. So the point of view of the character in the story, and not just their general point of view, but their point of view at that particular point of the story, that particular point of the narrative arc, become very important in generating the visuals. So the details that are selected for that description may change really quite radically depending on who the character is, who's the focus of the story at that particular point. And I think also there's another thing. Well, I mean, of course, if you've got somebody in love, a person in love, you've got a very different viewpoint. And I guess one of the reasons I included the picture on the left, I don't know what anybody thinks it is. Does anybody want to volunteer what they think it is? It's food, yeah, but it's food made to look like a tennis ball. And that is, I think, pistachio. I can't quite remember, but it's pistachio as grass. It's highly textural, and I guess if you're thinking of that same food from the perspective of different people, it could look delicious. It could look awful. If it's somebody who's in love and it's being given to them by the person who they love and it's an expression of love, then it could be very meaningful in a highly positive and emotional way. If it's an expensive meal given by somebody who is quite indifferent, it could almost feel insulting. If somebody has a particular food allergy, it could feel really disrespectful because the person has forgotten to think about the fact that they're allergic to nuts. So writing visuals, though that same plate of food is going to be really different depending on the character, the point in the story, and how it's written about, involves this embodiment. And I think the point I'm going to close on before opening for questions is, if we think back to that TikTok statistic, and if we think about how embedded visuals are now in everybody's experience and communication of day-to-day living. So if you think about the number of photos people post on Instagram, it's not quite so many. On Snapchat, visuals were really, that was kind of really, really regular. On Twitter, really, really regular. But of course, also on things like WhatsApp. So if families are in different countries, they will send photos to each other. So there's this constant exchange of visuals. People's phone cameras are now highly sophisticated. They can take really, really good pictures. Not only that, the phone software will offer to brighten your picture. They will offer to curate and edit your picture so that you can appear and feel like a professional photographer. So in that context, and this really is more of a question, what effect is that going to have on what it is to be particularly a visual storyteller? So as visuals and how to create visuals and how to frame visuals becomes more familiar to people, do they become blasé and in a funny sort of way lack criticality, so that visuals are now taken as part of our everyday life to such a degree that perhaps they aren't interrogated in the same way as they might have been. So there was one when I was at a kind of one of those amazing landmarks that everybody photographs, and what you can see is everybody snapping it, and this was some years ago. And there was one person I was with, it was part of a big group, didn't know them particularly well. They were the only person not photographing. And it's because he said it doesn't help me remember it, and it stops me seeing it. And so in the context of people who are perhaps photographing to an extent that they're not seeing, I wonder what that does to our job of writing visuals. So thank you very much. I do sometimes tweet, not a huge amount, but if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can also contact me. Thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions? Oh, yeah.
Thanks for this presentation. Very interesting. And I'm just curious, how do you see these artificial algorithms that write stories? And I mean, maybe they're a new revolutionary tool to write and to read, perhaps? Interesting to hear.
Yeah. Well, I think they're very interesting. I co-edited a special issue that was based on my research, and one of the submissions in that was somebody who'd experimented with trying to chat. This was before ChatGPT. This came out a couple of years ago now, and they'd done an experiment trying to have a conversation with the chatbot, and for me, that's a really interesting way of thinking about chatbots, and it sort of undermined, I suppose, the what can feel quite unnerving about things like chatbots and AI. I think there's a real limit to AI because, and this has been widely discussed by people like Margaret Mitchell, Timnit Gebru in the States. So what I think it was basically, I can't remember if it was Margaret Mitchell or not, but one of the ways that they have been described, these kind of AI creations, is if you imagine you're chatting to somebody and you're on an island and you think that it's you're chatting with a person and it feels really nice and they seem to really know you, but of course the AI has only got the information that exists already to draw on. So the large language models are drawing on what is there, and what is there is of course problematic and limited in and of itself. So the way this is spoken about, that if something unexpected comes, then suddenly, of course, the AI doesn't know what to do. I've been having some wonderful sessions with students this week, and one of them experimented with AI-generated images. And it may be that they may be happy to talk about that, because it was absolutely fascinating. I won't talk on their behalf, but it's going to be really interesting. AI is generating storylines in games, for example. I don't particularly think it's too worrying in terms of, I don't think it's going to sort of do storytellers out of a job. I know that writers in Hollywood are on strike at the moment because they're worried about AI taking some of their jobs. So it's not without, they are going to do some damage. They are going to do some damage to people's jobs as writers. But at the end of the day, one of the key things about creativity is that you're creating something new. And AI cannot do that. It can use what's there, it can assemble, but it can't create something new. So I suppose one of the things that I've seen is that people are having some fun with it, and I certainly enjoy that. Like everybody, I'm really unnerved by, I think the most unnerving aspect is when you think you're talking to a person and you're not. And I think that's really dangerous. And there was a CNN news item just the other day about a doll that has been taken off the market because it had the capacity to interact with children, and you know, they record and capture the conversation elsewhere, and essentially, ultimately, they could be starting to tell the kids to do stuff that's either dangerous or ethically problematic. So yeah, there's lots of dangers. There's also some fun to be had. I kind of feel like the most important thing is to kind of wait maybe a year and see what happens, because I think the other thing is, of course, there's a money imperative going on, and AI, if it makes money for people in one particular way, it will be developed in that way. So I think the money imperative is something that we don't yet understand how that's going to work. I mean, one of the things about data scraping and taking all people's data from social media, for example, so that every time you log on, that's tracked, you know, that has been collected, you know, without people necessarily even knowing why or what's going to be done with it, you know. So I think there's a huge number of unknowns still. But I think I would counsel against, along with other, as I say, people like Margaret Mitchell and Tim Gabru, I would counsel against the kind of scaremongering. Because I think AI is also quite limited, actually. Does that answer your question?
Yes, this is very good. And actually, I mean, maybe not so seriously, but among scientists there have been this, oh gosh, we're going to be out of work soon because AI is going to write up all the scientific manuscripts. But actually, I see it as a tool. You know, I can get a sketch and then work from that sketch. And I suppose maybe in creative art, sometimes you might have these situations that you have writer's block, for example, and then you get some kind of a draft, and it's easy to, oh, this doesn't work. That, oh, yes, I'll add this way, and and then another thing, of course, as a scientist, instead of doing a Google Scholar search for relevant literature, maybe I could someday ask AI to search through all the relevant literature and give me some kind of summaries. And this would, of course, then, you know, be sort of like improved Google search engine. But okay, you know, I was interested in hearing how on the creative side, but this is true what you said, that it's not good at being creative. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or observations?
I have one question or comment about the point of view part. It seems that humans are not just inclined in taking other people's point of view, but it's an evolutionary need. So it is very easy during maybe even one walk from this, let's say, from school to home, when you're walking, and then when you switch to driving, then while you're walking, you think that all the drivers are assholes, and then when you go into the car, all the walkers seem to be stupid, and the switch happens very quickly. Yeah. So it seems like taking someone else's point of view is something that we have some kind of preference, or even it's connected to the reward system of being a human being. So how do you see this point of view as something that will give maybe more enjoyment in both writing and consuming, that switching point of view can get people more and more engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a term that I find really useful for this, which is code switching. And code switching is a way of, because one of the things that people can feel a little bit concerned about is that somehow they're becoming inauthentic as they switch between these different platforms. And so that, you know, in order to be on Facebook, you know, one is one kind of person. In order to be a writer, one is another kind of person. But actually, if you're code switching, then it becomes much more about switching between a code that is appropriate for one situation and one kind of group, perhaps of friends, and another situation which is more appropriate for perhaps colleagues at work. And so then we're still our authentic self, but we're code switching appropriately for different situations. So that I think essentially makes this kind of switching that we do fine. Despite, because certainly as in writing, one is supposed, you know, it's kind of said in all the creative writing books, find your authentic voice, as if it's this single thing. Whereas actually code switching is a really important part, I think, of finding one's authentic voice. And the code switching is a really, really important part of moving between the different characters in a story, whether that's on the page or on the screen. The writer needs to be able to sort of find something in themselves that will enable them to shift between the different characters' points of view. So I think, and I think code switching is enriching. Actually, I think the way you phrased it is really interesting, Ellen, because I think it becomes enriching because it helps in the development of empathy. Actually, yeah. So I think that's my response. So I think we're at the end of the lecture now, and moving on to the next part. And I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. Thank you for the great questions. For all of those who would like to join, really hope you will. We're going to sit outside, so there's a little area outside. Thank you.